Welcome to Lekpa's tutorial. My name is Dr. Lekpa David. Today we'll be looking at the anatomy of the brain. I believe and I hope that you have watched the previous videos on the introduction of anatomy as well as classification of the nervous system. Today we look at the brain. The brain is one of the largest organs in the body and it controls all mental functions, all the activities of the body. As I've stated in our introduction about the functions of the brain, our body activities, control of our environment, and everything we do is a function of the brain. So the brain generally controls the entire activity of the nervous system and even other systems in the body. It is composed of about more than 100 billion neurons. You can imagine how powerful the brain is. The brain comprises about 2 to 3% of the body weight, and it utilizes about or over 20% of body's energy. The brain is an important organ in the body. Let's look at the divisions of the brain. There are two schools of thoughts in the divisions of the brain. In our previous slide, we talked about forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain, and their various derivatives. Today, we are going to look at it from this classification, whereby the brain is divided into the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the large portion that occupies most of the cranium and is divided into right and left hemisphere. Now we have the cerebellum. Cerebellum is the posterior inferior portion of the brain. Then after those lobes that comes out of it, from the cerebrum down, we have something that like a stem, like a tree and a stem. So that part of the brain is called the brain stem. And this brain stem consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. It is from the medulla oblongata that the brain continues downward as it passes through the foramen of magnum to become the spinal cord. Okay, the diencephalon, of course, is part of the classification we talked before. So it's located above the midbrain, which comprises of the thalamus, epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. So let's look at the brain proper, or the cerebrum. Now, looking at the cerebrum is the largest division of the brain that occupy the cranial fossa, as the cranium. It accounts for about 85% of the brain mass. If you look at the structure on the screen, you see this is the cerebrum. This part you are seeing is the cerebrum. It occupies about 18% of the entire brain mass. This cerebrum is divided into right and left hemisphere by what we call the longitudinal feature. Look at it here. This line, we divide it into two hemispheres. If you cut this open, you will have two halves of the brain. And what connects the two halves together is called the corpus callosum. Called the corpus callosum. So if you look at this other diagram here, you see the half of the brain being cut, and this is the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Now, the brain has two components or two layers. We have the cerebral cortex and the cerebral medulla. Now, the cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain. The part that you see that is on the surface, that is outside, is called the cerebral cortex. This cerebral cortex is made up of gray matter. Then the inner portion, the inner parts of the cerebrum is called the medulla. That is the inner layer. And this medulla is made up of white matter. The cerebrum the cerebral cortex has several lobes, names after the bones that they cover. So when you see the cranium and the various bones of the cranium, when you remove the cranium from the cranial cavity where you have the brain, you will see the cerebral cortex, and then the lobes of the cerebral cortex are named according to the cranial bones. The cranial bones are, we have the frontal bones. So the part that is within the frontal bone is called the frontal cortex, or they call the frontal lobe. This frontal lobe basically is responsible for reasoning, motor control, emotions, and language. Those centers are located within the frontal lobes of the brain. Then we have the part that is on top of the cranium is called the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe processes sensory information such as touch, temperature, and pain. Then we have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is by the side. Is by the side. That is where the center, the area that controls hearing, memory, emotions, and some aspect of language is also located. Then finally, we have the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is at the back here, where most information about vision, integrating visual information, is being processed, is being done at the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. You can see from the structure here, the one that is in front here is the frontal lobe. The one at the back here is the occipital lobe. The one on top with a blue painting is the parietal lobe. And then we have the purple here as the temporal lobes of the brain. Now, there are different functions of each of these lobes. The frontal lobe control movements of voluntary skeletal muscles. Within the frontal lobe, there are what we call association area, which they carry on high level of intellectual processing. So when you want to solve mathematical problem, you want to solve problem, you are reasoning, you are planning, concentrating, memory, behavior, emotion, expression. All these are functions of the frontal lobes of the brain. So when you are learning in school, it is the frontal lobe that is responsible for all the activities you do, especially when it has to do with learning and memory consolidation. The temporal lobe, that is sensory area, has to do with hearing and balance. The association area interprets sensory experiences, memory of visual scene, music, smell, and other complex sensory patterns. So these are carried out within the temporal lobe of the brain. So the next lobe of the brain is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe, and this parietal lobe is concerned with interpretation of the sense of touch, pressure, pain on the surface of the skin. Some association area also responsible for understanding of speech, using words to express thoughts and feelings. The occipital lobe generally is responsible for visual processing and interpretation of visual impulses or stimuli. The association area combines both visual images with sensory experience. It's important for us to know that within this cerebellum, cerebral cortex, when we go deeper into neuroscience, we'll tell you each there are different areas, area 1, area 2, area 3, like that has specific function apart from the generalized ones that I've just told you now. But that is not within the scope of this particular video, because this video is to make anybody to understand how the brain is and how it functions. If we look at the surface of the cerebral cortex, we'll see that there are some ridges. You can see a ridge that is on the surface of the cerebral cortex. This ridge is called gyrus. Then all of them, in plural, they are called gyri. Then between the gyrus, you see depression. There's a depression between various reaches that is here, and that is called a sulcus or a plural sulci. The sulci and the gyri, they play critical role in learning, understanding, and memory. So in fact, some school of thought have said the deeper your sulci, the more intelligent you are. But some other papers have also said that that is not true. We'll talk about that later. Now, taking a section of the brain, maybe a coronal section of the brain, you will see of the cerebral cortex, you discover that the cerebral cortex has 6 layers. Layer 1 is known as the molecular layer. Layer 2 is the outer granular layer. Layer 3 is the outer pyramidal layer. Layer 4 is the inner granular layer. Layer 5 is the inner pyramidal layer. And layer 6 is the polymorphic layer. These are the layers of the cerebral cortex. These layers contain some cells that we'll discuss later as well. Okay, now let's look at the diencephalon. The diencephalon is the area of the brain containing the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. The thalamus is an oval structure that is made up of about 80% of the diencephalon, comprises of a pair of oval mass, mostly gray matter. This thalamus is the principle of relay station between various sections of the brain is carried out by the thalamus. So it serves as a relay station to connect different areas of the brain. This is the thalamus. This is the thalamus, the side that is painted green is the thalamus. So it serves as a relay station. You can see the thalamus here in the structure that is located in this diagram. The thalamus has various nuclei, which, as we proceed in the subsequent video, well, I will dissect and to talk about the various nuclei of the thalamus as well as that of the hypothalamus. But this video is for beginners so that you can understand these parts of the brain. You can see the thalamus here at the center, like an egg. These structures are looking like an egg. Is the thalamus. It's thalamus. So the hypothalamus, the word hypo meaning that is below the thalamus. So it's the small portion of the diencephalon located below the thalamus. It is one of the main regulator of homeostasis in the body. It also helps in other activities in the body. The hypothalamus is protected by the sella turcica of the phrenoid bone, closely related to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus coordinates the nervous system and the endocrine system. There's a lot of connectivity between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Therefore, making the hypothalamus to function both as an endocrine organ as well as a nervous organ. The hypothalamus is the center of the brain that is responsible for taste, hunger, and satiation. When you want to drink water, when you have drank enough water, it is the hypothalamus that control those behavior. When you are hungry, when you eat food or you want to eat food, it is the hypothalamus that regulates or controls the activity. Satiation, when you feel satisfied, it is the hypothalamus that controls those activities of the body. Sleep pattern and wakening states is also a function. Sex drive, aggression, they are all a function of the hypothalamus. So your limbic, sorry, your libido, when someone is having high libido, low libido is being controlled by the hypothalamus. Libido, or we call it sexual desire or sexual urge, is a function of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus also influences the activity of the GIT. The hypothalamus control the endocrine glands I've talked about, and they also help in regulating the body temperature. You can see the hypothalamus just below the thalamus is the part that is painted green. It's important to note as well that there's a subthalamic nuclei or the subthalamus that is within the diencephalon, but we discussed that when we are talking about the basal ganglion, so that you see how they play a role there. So the hypothalamus, like the thalamus too, has several nuclei, several nuclei. We have the supraoptic nuclei, suprachiasmatic nuclei, as so many of them, which when we go deeper into neuroscience, I will talk about the various nuclei and their function. Now, let's go down to the stem. We are done with the cerebrum, the cortex, and the medulla. So let's go to the stem, the brain stem. The brain stem, that is the most inferior portion of the brain. Connect the brain to the spinal cord. So the brain is between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. It's the brain stem that is that connectivity, that structure that connects the brain and the spinal cord. So there are three areas of this brain stem, beginning from the cerebrum, the medulla of the cerebrum, the diencephalon. You see the midbrain. Midbrain, that's middle brain. It's middle, it's in between. So when you after the midbrain, you get to the pons, then you get to the medulla oblongata before the spinal cord. As the medulla oblongata passes through the foramen magnum, the central nervous system continue as the spinal cord. The midbrain. The midbrain is the portion that is painted green in this a diagram showing here. So is superior to the pons, just superior to the pons, the midbrain. It connects the brainstem to the diencephalon. The midbrain function as a relay system as well, transmitting information necessary for vision and hearing. It also plays important role in motor movement, pain, and sleep-wake cycle. So it is the midbrain that controls our sleep-wake cycle and also responsible for some motor activity. When we talked about the basal ganglion, you also see how some parts of the midbrain play a role in that's movement activity. The pons and the midbrain is this structure you are seeing here is showing us structures within the pons and the midbrain where some cranial nerves comes out of the brain. We also have a video for the 12 cranial nerves and then the spinal nerves. This is the pons. The part painted green is the pons immediately after the midbrain. Inferior to the midbrain, we have the pons. So the pons lies superior to the medulla, but and as well as inferior to the midbrain. Together with the medulla, they help to control the respiratory system of the body. That's why this part of our brain, where we have the medulla and the midbrain, is very important because that's where we have the center that controls respiration. The medulla oblongata is the part that is painted green here, and is the most inferior portion of the brain. Connect the brainstem to the spinal cord. It has the center responsible for respiration and the rhythms and the depth of breathing. It also has a cardiovascular center where it regulates the heart rate and contraction force. It's also influenced vasoconstriction and vasodilatation. You can see how important the pons and the medulla is to our body because anything that affects this place, if somebody should use hand and hit here, it will affect this center and somebody can get to a state of coma or even death. The medulla oblongata controls coughing, vomiting, swallowing, and hiccups. Hiccup when we hiccup. Those activities are controlled by the medulla oblongata. You can see that this is the structure showing the medulla and as a continuum of the spinal cord. Now, the other small lobe of the brain that is not within the stem area is called the cerebellum. It's called the cerebellum. The part that is painted green is the cerebellum. Cerebellum is the largest portion of the brain and it occupies the inferior and the posterior aspects of the cranial fossa. This cerebellum processes information, sensory information of balance, coordination, maintenance of posture, and equilibrium. For us to stand erect, for us to coordinate our movement, for us to balance, it is a function of the cerebellum. It's a function of the cerebellum. Cerebellum helps us to maintain balance, control our gait, regulates how we move, and maintain equilibrium. This cerebellum has two lobes, two hemispheres, like the cerebrum. It has two hemispheres, like the cerebrum. So the what demarcates the two hemisphere, look at this structure with the cursor here, it's called the vermis. It's called the vermis. And then each hemisphere has several lobes. We have the posterior lobe, we have the frontomedulla lobes, we have the anterior lobes, as the case may be. Now, if you look at this cerebellum, you will see its special nature, whereby a lot of structures are seen within the cerebellum. So, as I said earlier, it controls movements, regulate movement. Now, important thing for us to note about the brain as we continue on this lecture is what we call the ventricular system of the brain. The ventricles. What are ventricles? The ventricles are potential space that is found within the brain. So these spaces are located within, so we have what we call the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle. So the lateral ventricle are found located within each hemisphere of the cerebrum, and it communicates with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Moro. The third ventricle is a vertical slit between the lateral ventricle and the inferior to the right and left half of the thalamus. It communicates with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. So this, if you look at this structure here, you will see, okay, I think there's a better structure that will make us to see that well. Now, the fourth ventricle is the space between the brainstem and the cerebellum. These spaces is where the cerebrospinal fluid flows. Okay, this is the structure I was talking about. So you can see the lateral ventricle. These are the two lateral ventricles. It flows through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueducts into the fourth ventricle, and then flow like that to the spinal cord. To the spinal cord. Now, within the ventricle lies what we call the colloid plexus. This is where the ependymal cells are found. So the network of capillaries in the walls of the ventricles are called the colloid plexus. So the ependymal cells are part of a connective tissue where they help to form cerebrospinal fluid. Their major function is to secrete the cerebrospinal fluid. And this cerebrospinal fluid helps to keep the brain intact, helps to protect the brain, helps to nourish the brain, helps to protect the brain from harmful substances and nourish the brain to make sure that the brain is in a better, healthy state. So this cerebrospinal fluid, once it is secreted in the colloid plexus, they flow down from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid spaces to the arachnoid villi or dura venous system, like that to the system. So you can see this structure is showing the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid from the from the brain to the spinal cord. I've already mentioned some of the functions of the cerebrospinal fluid, which is a mechanical function. They serve as shock absorber to help the brain not to be damaged. They act as chemical protector. They give the brain chemical protections to ensure that the environment for neural signal is optimized and is okay. They also act as a medium for exchange of nutrients and waste between the brain and other nerve within the blood and nervous tissue. Okay, let's discuss the blood supply to the brain. As I stated earlier, the brain consumes so much energy. So most of the metabolic activity uh, occur in the brain is involved in so much metabolic activity. So the brain consume up to about 20% of the available oxygen to use to do its functions. So the brain is well supplied with oxygen and nutrients. So this oxygen and nutrient is transported to the brain through the blood vessels. Through the blood vessels. So the blood supply to the brain, the arteries that form the arterial supply to the brain, form what we call the arterial circle of Willis. Arterial circles of Willis. These arterial circles of Willis is formed from branches of the basilar artery. You can see the basilar artery here in this diagram. From the basilar artery, we have the posterior cerebral artery, we have the posterior communicating artery, we have the anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery, middle cerebral artery, and then together with the internal carotid artery, you can see the cycle that is being formed to supply blood to the brain. So each of these branches have their terminal branches to different parts of the brain where the oxygen and nutrients are supplied. Now, having discussed that, it is important for us to note that the brain is protected or covered by what we call meninges. The meninges protect the brain from damages from the superior point of view, from the cranial bones. So these meninges are made up of connective tissues that are found within the brain and spinal cord. Three layers of protection, three layers of coverings. The first layer is the dura mater. The dura mater is the outermost layer that is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue that protect the brain from damage. The second layer is the arachnoid layer, which is also the middle layer. It is the second and the middle layer. This arachnoid layer is made up of a spider web arrangement of collagen fibers. Then the third layer is the pia mater. That's the innermost layer and is the most delicate layers of the brain because it's directly connected with the brain tissue. So the protection of this protection given by these meninges to the brain is key in helping the brain to function very well. So you can see from this diagram about the layers of the brain. This is the dura mater. This is the periosteal layer. This is the meningeal layer, subarachnoid space. This is subarachnoid space. Then you can see how it is being. This is from this cranial, from the frontal plane here. You can see the layers of the coverings of the brain. The brain is also protected by the cerebrospinal fluid, which we discussed earlier, because the cerebrospinal fluid ensures that the brain is protected from microbes and other substances that may want to damage the brain as they passes through to the brain. So in conclusion, we have discussed the brain, looking at the various divisions of the brain. We've looked at the cerebrum. We've looked at the layers of the cerebrum, which we talked about as the cortex and the medulla. We've looked at the structures that are found on the surfaces of the cerebral cortex, called the gyrus and the sulci, gyrus and sulcus, or gyri and sulci, singular and plural. We've also looked at the layers, the 6 layers of the cerebral cortex. We went further to look at the medulla, the deeper region of the cerebrum, which we talked about the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the epithalamus and their functions. We discussed the stem, the brain stem, which begin from the midbrain, then to the pons and to the medulla oblongata, where we as well talked about their various functions, and for you to get the basic understanding of what they do. And as we continue in our lectures and subsequent video, we'll take each of these regions one by one and give you detailed neuroscience or neuroanatomy of that region, and you understand how they function. Then we went further to look at the ventricular system of the brain. We talk about the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. And there are various foramina that connect them together. We also look at the production of cerebrospinal fluid within this ventricle. We talked about the colloid plexus, where the cerebrospinal fluid is being produced through the epidermal cells, which is one of the connective tissue. Then we talked about the blood supply to the brain, the arterial circles of Willis, and then the meninges. I believe with these few things we have discussed today about the brain, you have gotten the the primary things you need to know about the brain. So in our subsequent video, maybe in our next video, we'll talk about the cranial nerve, I'll talk about the spinal cord, and then when we are done with the entire nervous system, we can come back to be looking at various parts of this brain and spinal cord in our neuroscience section of this video. Thank you so much, and I appreciate. Keep watching this video, subscribe to this video, share this video to as many as you can. Thank you, and bye-bye. See you in the next video. Bye.